Good afternoon and a really warm welcome to St Mary's. I'm Elizabeth, I'm the rector here. Welcome for what is going to be, I know, a really interesting talk and discussion about what does it mean to be human in an age of AI. I think we may even have some people with us online, either in real time or later. And of course, as we are putting it online on YouTube, you can watch back later if you would like with Simon's slides. I think we're going to try and link those things together. Speaking of slides, just before I introduce Simon, we have got some chairs right at the front. So if now or once we start showing the slides you find that you can't see properly, please do come closer. I know that's a deeply un-Anglican thing to do, but if you want to be able to see, do come closer. So I'm delighted to introduce Reverend Dr. Simon Cross, who has come all the way from Oxford to be with us this afternoon. Simon works for the Bishop of Oxford and the Church of England, researching and offering policy advice on AI and technology ethics. So thank you, Simon.
Afternoon. Thank you so much for coming out on what is a slowly brightening Sunday afternoon. And I wasn't here this morning in the rain. A slight mix and match here. I'm going to have to peer over my shoulders periodically to make sure that you're looking at the slide I think you should be looking at. And there's going to be a lot of next slide, please, in the style of Chris Whitty, I think. So my apologies for that. If you can't see, please do the un-Anglican thing and come forward. And if you want to go over this talk again at a future date, I'm very happy for you to have copies of both the talk that I'm giving now and the slides to go over at your own pace. Let me expand just a little bit on what qualifies me to lead this session for you. I have a few degrees in theology. As I got further on in my theological education, I specialised more and more in the relationship between science and theology. And I got particularly interested by the end of that process in the philosophical tensions around the disagreements between science and theology on how God does what God does, divine action. And it's a relatively short step from being interested in science and theology to being interested in technology and theology. And so for the last 5 years or so, I've been researching a cluster of issues around technology ethics, AI as it is now almost universally being called, and its implications for us as a culture and a society, and supporting both the Bishop of Oxford and other bishops in the Church of England, and particularly those in the House of Lords, to do with government regulatory approaches to some of this stuff. So there's more than I can possibly talk to you about AI in the next 45 minutes or so. But there's an awful lot going on, isn't there? Could we have the next slide, please? You may recall that in November of last year, the AI hosted a global AI summit. And the next slide, please. One of the things the government said at the end of that was that artificial intelligence presents enormous global opportunities. It can transform and enhance human well-being, peace and prosperity. But it needs to be designed, developed, deployed, used in a manner that's safe, human-centric, trustworthy and responsible. All of which I think needs a bit of unpicking, right? We don't say that about tractors. Why are we saying all of that about AI? I think in this talk what I would like to do, if I can, for you, is to cut through the clamour. I can't possibly address all of the issues that AI raises, but I think it's helpful to get to the heart of what kinds of debates this technology is provoking by clarifying a single question. What does it mean to be human in an age of AI? And so over the next maybe 40 minutes or so, I want to cut through some of the clamour and confusion for you. I want to offer you a quick, non-technical explanation of how AI works, what it means to be AI. And then I want to highlight what is, I think, a fundamental difference between what it means to be AI and what it means to be human. And along the way, I want to flag some of the potential risks and problems with this technology and suggest some practical advice for you as you go away from here and face all the clever things this is starting to do in your life, whether you want it to or not. Next slide, please. What is AI? Well, some people think it's Pandora's box, the last things human beings are ever going to invent. It's the next step in the universe's evolution. They come in two different flavours. You can already see the first flavour, the sour lemons. The sour lemons think that AI is going to destroy us in one of two ways. Either it's going to abruptly become infinitely more clever than us and just boot us off the world stage, or because we're so stupid we just can't help blowing ourselves up on the way to inventing this stuff. On the other side, you have, next slide please, the sweet strawberries. The sweet strawberries think that AI is the vehicle to a new post-human existence, a post-work eternal life of ease. We get to download or upload our minds, I suppose, depending on your cosmology. But whatever we do, we get to let the machines do the dirty work while we just drift around the cosmos until the final heat death. So either AI is the proverbial Pandora's box, or, next slide please, it's just branch computing. Now, which of those two very contrasting options you choose is going to depend on, next slide please, your understanding of two things: what it means to be AI and what it means to be human. So let's start with a non-technical explanation of what it means to be AI. Next slide please. This is Alan Turing. Before him, the word computer meant a human being, usually a woman as it happened, whose job it was to compute, to do maths. But standard histories of artificial intelligence always point to two seminal events. The first is that in the 1930s, Alan Turing proposed a device called a universal Turing machine. Next slide, please. It's a method of reducing all computation to a process that depends only on whether a particular component is on or off. All computation is the cumulative result of these binary choices, a 1 for O, a 0 for off. What could be simpler than that? But Turing's genius was to see a way of writing a type of program to control this binary on-off. Next slide, please. To produce paths that could be varied depending on the task and yet achieve any task a computer can do. So the reason your own computer can be a computer, a word processor, a video player, a calculator, all the clever things it can do, is because it is a version of what has ever since that famous 1930s paper been called a universal Turing machine. The thing is, that's a bit of a mouthful, isn't it? So we just call them computers. Now, in the less visited corners of the internet, there are arguments about the difference between calling these sequences of instructions a computer, a program rather, or an algorithm. But both of those words refer to a process of putting instructions for extracting, processing, and printing out information in a very deliberate order. The second major event in AI folklore, a conference at Dartmouth College in the USA in the 1950s, which brought together the godfathers of AI. Next slide, please. No. Context is everything. I see what I've done. I've left out a letter there. Next slide, please. Brought together the godfathers of AI. This conference was where and when the term artificial intelligence was coined, and it set out the basic philosophical and many of the very practical approaches that AI has wrestled with and about ever since. Okay, but that this happened in America in the 1950s is important and worth noting, because there are a series of connections between American universities, the US government, the US defense and intelligence community, and eventually those links which would show themselves in Silicon Valley, the home of the so-called big tech companies like Amazon and Facebook and Google, and you'll notice the lack of godmothers in the image behind me. Because what I want to point out to you is that those connections are social and political and economic, and they're not just technological. Okay, so there's one last thing I think it's worth us really understanding about how AI works, and this, I'm pleased to tell you, is the most technical we're going to get. Next slide, please. You've probably heard the phrase neural net in connection with AI, the physical architecture, which is modeled physically on the structure of the human brain. The brain has neurons which connect together and combine in regions to perform specific tasks. And all of the really big breakthroughs in AI over the last 30 or 40 years have come about through replicating this same basic brain-like form and then inventing ever more sophisticated ways to structure and weight the paths that the processor takes. Next slide, please. So all you need to remember about AI really is that whatever kind of computation it's doing, sorry, next slide if we could please, thanks. There we go. So here's a basic map of a neural net that is looking to process imagery, okay? But it's modeled on the same structure that the human brain functions through, okay? So the only thing that you really need to understand about this is that artificial intelligence combines mathematics and logic in an algorithm to predict the right answer. Every single output is a best statistical guess, and tuning an AI algorithm is all about clever ways to make it guess better and more often. So here's a fun example I came across very recently that'll show you how sophisticated this kind of guessing has now become in the world of natural language. Have a look at this picture. A guy called Max Whitby said, "I thought I would see what GPT-4, the thing that lies underneath ChatGPT, I thought I would see what it makes of my kitchen food compost bin in the style of a wise fortune teller inspecting tea leaves." Okay, this is a guy's kitchen bin. Here's what the AI said. "In the vast tapestry of this moment captured, the fragile eggshell of vulnerability stands out. It's a reminder of our delicate nature, how we can be both strong and brittle at the same time. But with this fragility lies immense potential waiting to break free. Much like a bird waiting to hatch, to spread its wings and soar into the vast skies. The acid lemon, sharp and poignant, represents the unexpected twists life throws our way. Sometimes sour, sometimes refreshing, it's a testament to life's unpredictable nature. Ah, the brooding broccoli, a symbol of growth and nourishment and the many layers of our being. Just as the broccoli has its many florets, so does our personality. The crumpled tea bags of dashed expectations." And it goes on a bit about crumpled tea bags. "And then the surrounding fog of mould, clouding the clarity, making the path ahead uncertain. The challenges, the doubts, the fears that often cloud our judgment," and it goes on a bit about the fog. In the dance of these elements, there's a story of life, of trials, tribulations, joys and sorrows, growth and decay. Embrace the journey, dear seeker. May your path be lit with wisdom, and may you find the strength to navigate the delicate balance of life's offerings. Safe travels, dear seeker. Next slide, please. Wow. But can GPT-4 taste sourness or sweetness? Does it know what it is to suffer dashed expectations? Was the Google engineer, Brad Lemoine, who hit the headlines a couple of years ago, right when he decided that the AI he had been working on had finally become conscious? Does it mean that AI has finally become just like us? Or is this just a cumulative but brute best guess at what a human fortune teller might say about those particular tea leaves? Next slide, please. This is the fundamental question, I think, that we need to be asking ourselves at this juncture. Is there more to being human than just computable intelligence? What does it mean to be human? And how we answer this question will shape our view about whether AI is indeed Pandora's box or just a new branch of computing. Next slide, please. This is Daniel Dennett. Daniel Dennett is an evolutionary biologist and a powerful voice for a very particular form of atheism. And its answer to the question, what does it mean to be human? Dennett firmly believes we are machines. He recently said that he thinks our minds and bodies are a, and I quote, consortia of tiny robots. But the thing is, Dennett is only following one of the original godfathers, actually, one of those Dartmouth conference attendees, Marvin Minsky, who's widely quoted as saying that the human brain is just a meat machine. Next slide, please. This is Joseph Weizenbaum. Now, he wasn't at Dartmouth, but Weizenbaum created one of the first ever chatbots, not Alexa, but rather Eliza, in the 1960s. The thing is that Joe Weizenbaum was utterly horrified at what followed from his experiments with Eliza on his students, because he discovered that his test subjects could not help themselves and could not stop treating Eliza as if she were a real human being. It got to the point where his own secretary, who had seen everything, all of the lines of code, all the ways in which Eliza would trip up and fail, sat down at the computer terminal to talk to Eliza one day, for this is how you conversed with it, and turned around and said to Joe, would you mind giving us some privacy, please? Joe Weizenbaum became increasingly concerned about the impact he saw technology having on human beings around him. And he raised the possibility, way back in the 1970s, that there are things we ought not to get computers to do, even if it looks like they can do them in the same way and as well and efficiently as we do, because computers are fundamentally different to us. AI is fundamentally different to human being. So let's take this basic question. What does it mean to be human? And let's ask it in a way a computer would like. Next slide, please. Are you just a warm, wet computer? 1 for yes, O for no. I'll offer you my answer to that question in a second, but first, I want to discuss why it even seems like a sensible question to ask in the first place. And the only way we can do that is if we're going to zoom out far enough and recognize the way that today's debates are all shaped by a very specific worldview, one that predates Dartmouth, predates Turing, predates all of us. It's one that the West has been embroiled in for the better part of 500 years now, but one that is, I think, coming under increasing pressure at the moment. So could I have the next slide, please? Here's a man called Charles Taylor. In 2007, Taylor wrote a book called A Secular Age. Over the course of almost 800 pages, what he does is he tracks the changing view of what it means to be human over the course of the last 400 or 500 years in Western Europe. And Taylor detects a series of what he calls subtraction stories that gradually explain away the central human experience of transcendence, of awe, of wonder, of love, until we're left with what Taylor calls an immanent frame in which we're all just isolated individuals, and consciousness itself, our own conscious experience, is just a matter of personal belief. personal preference even. In fact, says Daniel Dennett, consciousness is just an illusory byproduct of brain processes. A very popular modern thinker called Yuval Noah Harari compares consciousness to the noise a jet engine makes. The unavoidable byproduct of what happens when you make a machine out of meat, I guess. But, says Taylor, this fracturing of a shared overarching answer to the question, what does it mean to be human? Well, it doesn't actually answer that question at all, and it certainly doesn't resolve the ambiguities. And so society begins to wrestle with what Taylor calls cross pressures that stem from a lack of any consensus about what it means to be human, let alone what it means to be AI. And so hopefully now you're beginning to see why, as well as how, it can be the case that AI is either Pandora's box or just a branch of computing, depending on who you want to talk to. Now, I haven't mentioned the role of language so far, but the way we describe and explain AI profoundly influences the meaning. So when Daniel Dennett talks about a consortia of tiny robots, is he speaking scientifically or is he speaking poetically? What about when we say that AI creates or decides or discovers? How are we using those words? Because if we mean words like consortia or choose in exactly the same sense as we mean them when we speak about human beings, then of course there's no difference between us and our machines. And one tip I will offer you, if I may, as you go away from here, is to begin to pay attention not just to which words are being used to describe technology, but how those words are being used. Are we all just universal Turing machines? Are universal Turing machines truly universal? Could a machine ever become spiritual? Next slide, please. A speaker always has to choose what to leave out as well as what to include. And I have not mentioned any of AI's impacts on jobs, its rapidly increasing energy and ecological footprint, let alone any of those subtler impacts that AI now has on our social media, our politics, our capacity to tell what is real or true. The Bletchley Declaration last November said this about them: AI poses significant risks, including to daily life. To that end, we welcome relevant international efforts to examine and address the potential impacts of AI. We recognise the need to protect human rights, transparency, explainability, fairness, accountability, regulation, safety, appropriate human oversight, ethics, bias, privacy and data protection. Did I say that quickly enough for you all? We also note the potential for unforeseen risks stemming from the capability to manipulate content. Next slide, please. Neither of those images is real. The Pope in a Balenciaga jacket. President Trump bowing to kneeling to pray in a church, but you might want to count how many fingers Trump has in that photo. But the thing is, the technology is advancing at such pace that very soon there will be no way for us to use our senses to determine what is fake and what is real. And so the next slide, please. Some recent headlines about deceptive content. A man who killed himself after talking to a chatbot. A very skeptical financial employee who was duped out of 25 million because he was convinced the three people he was on the video call to were genuinely his colleagues who he worked with day in and day out. Now, all of these issues are critically important, say the people at Bletchley, and we affirm the necessity and urgency of addressing them. I hope we might take up some of these questions and concerns in the discussion that follows, and I'm drawing to a close now. But to say that artificial intelligence is just a branch of computing is not to say that the harms of outsourcing key features of human being to machines is a trivial matter. Quite the opposite. Next slide, please. And so this question, what does it mean to be human in an age of AI? It's crucial that we place that question in the right philosophical register. And despite the dreams and fears and subtraction stories, being fully human in the age of AI means exactly the same thing it has meant for the last however many millennia. So mysterious human experiences like awe and wonder and love and justice and the need for mutually meaningful relationships and a sense of purpose, and even personal idiosyncrasies like, next slide please, the moose, a soft spot for the moose. That's something that makes me, me. Those are the same things that make the me who's listening to my words now, you. They're not accidental, let alone irrelevant, and perhaps they can be computationally mimicked, but that doesn't mean they are in themselves unimportant, let alone also fake. In which case, their external mimicry by AI carries substantial risks for society, which is the very thing Joseph Weizenbaum began to warn us about 50 or 60 years ago now. So the question each of us has to decide is whether these essential human qualities of wonder and love and justice and mercy, next slide please, whether they can be fully reproduced using solely mathematical techniques of prediction, based on the feedstock of data, or whether they can only ever be mimicked. Is the claim that you and your brain are just a warm, wet computer true? Next slide, please. Or is it just the latest and greatest of all subtraction stories? AI uses data to learn patterns, and from those to make predictions. And more data means more and clearer patterns, and so potentially better guesses. Hence the large in large language model. How large? Well, I exaggerate not when I say imagine tens of thousands of computer chips making billions of calculations about trillions of data points and taking 100 or more days to do so. But what I said about, next slide please, what I said about the influences of AI being not just technical, but also social, political and economic. The thing is this, if your main feedstock for your technology is the internet, and I might add the internet written in English, then when you ask it to find the hidden patterns in the data and use them to predict the future, it will replicate the past, however unjust that past may be. And so its ingredients will contain a lot of words and pictures produced by young white men with racist and misogynistic opinions. It will contain a lot of stolen intellectual property to fold up inside its little black boxes. It will turn out to be much better at detecting skin cancer if you have a lighter skinned tone than if you have a dark skinned tone. And it will always guess over time towards the statistical average, except when it guesses things that sound entirely plausible but bear no resemblance to the real world. A euphemism they like to call hallucination at this point. So let me wind up, and then I'm going to hand over to you. In conclusion, I've kept posing for you this central question. What does it mean to be human in an age of AI? I want to stand here and reaffirm that artificial intelligence is not calling into question the Christian answer to that question. What does it mean to be human? Instead, Christian understanding of human beings as free-willed, conscious, unified bodies and souls and spirits, that offers not only ready answers to life's most urgent questions and society's struggling cross-pressures, but it also offers an ethical framework for answering that other crucial question, which we can only get to once we've answered for ourselves this question about what it means to be human. What ought computers to be used for? And what ought computers not to be used for, even if they appear able to do those things? Similarly, Christianity's answer to the two deeper questions of human being and purpose, those are not being called into any kind of philosophical question by anything that I see in the technology around me, either today or in the foreseeable future. Rather, I think they can be pressed into better service to answer those questions for people who have ears to fear. Because I have to say, if you ask me, AI is just a branch of computing. So I've given you a lot to think about in this presentation. I'm going to suggest that we treat ourselves to 2 minutes of silence while you all digest. And then I'm going to hand back to Elizabeth, and when you're ready, if you would like to ask a question, I'll do my best to answer it. If you'd like to add to a debate and a discussion between yourselves, I'd be delighted to listen to what you have to say. But I thank you for listening to me, and I look forward to what happens next.
Silence is golden and also full of birdsong. That's what I could hear over that side. So thank you so much, Simon, for all that you've shared with us. What questions do you have?
I was puzzling during your presentation about what we know and what we don't know. And I was thinking about it partly in biological terms, because there are things that happen in a human body which do not require conscious thought, breathing in, heartbeats, and a number of other necessary and vital bodily functions, but ones over which we don't exert conscious control. And it seemed to me that there might be a comparison between our lack of ability to understand what's going on between computers, and whether the question that we really are trying to grapple with is not what it means for us to be human in the presence of AI, but whether it's possible for AI to be sentient in the ways that other living organisms or organisms in the world appear to be sentient in ways which we do not understand. So we guess lots of things about, do fungus communicate? Do they really have a network? Because we can only see what they do, we can't communicate with them to find out what their motivation might be, or why they're doing it, or how they might be doing it. And it seemed to me that there are some comparisons there with AI. Is it underneath what we can see, even on these screens here? Is something else going on that we are not yet aware of, but we won't be aware of until the day it's too late to stop it?
So, in one respect, I slightly dread this portion of the afternoon because I get asked lots of questions I don't have answers to. Okay? I'm very interested in the philosophical questions, and there are a set of philosophical questions which simply do not have knockdown answers. Right? Men and women of equal intellect and faith commitment land on different sides of life's thorniest questions. So I don't want to be unduly dogmatic here and say that I have a confidence about things which I can't be certain of. But I would say two things in response to that. First, that I think that it is important to differentiate between biological systems and mechanical systems. And we live in a culture, and I think Charles Taylor has helped to surface some of why this is the case. We live in a culture that just wants to close or completely eliminate the gap between those two things. And some of the cross pressures that society is wrestling with now might be because we need to do more to protect and even perhaps in some cases widen that gap. So, first of all, whenever people want to talk about biological organisms and machines in the same sense, personally, I always just want to take a little bit of a step backwards myself and say, what is the gap here? Is it being noted? And how are people either trying to close it or open it up? Not because I think there's a single way of doing any of those things. I think you've asked a pertinent question, but I think that from what I see of how this technology functions, it doesn't have, despite what is sometimes, I think, slightly misleading language, it doesn't have those completely autonomous capabilities. So we talk about unsupervised learning, we talk about self-reinforcement learning, but of course what you don't do is throw a whole bunch of gadgets together in a box and say, tell me what a cat is. There's quite a lot more going on. So when we talk about self-supervised learning, actually what the machine is doing is it's following a recipe, but it's being given a certain degree of, and again, I'm stretching language here, when I say it's being given a certain amount of autonomy. If you remember the image of the neural network and all those potential paths through, what you're in effect saying to a self-supervised learning machine is, play around, have as many experiments as you like, try and trace as many paths as you like, and I'll tell you when you're getting warmer and I'll tell you when you're getting colder, but it's up to you to work out what you think is the optimum path. Okay? But does that really describe the parasympathetic nervous system in an animal? I'm not sure. So I'm just cautious about talking with words in a single sense of meaning when actually we're really, I think, stretching their meaning and starting to use quite a few words, either as analogy or as poetry.
Just as on what about the interface between the human brain and an artificial limb, for example, or instructing a computer by thought and obviously a wireless terminal to do certain things? Does that alter your answer in any way?
Not for me personally, no, because I absolutely understand that you can put an implant into someone's brain and you can give them full function over their hand. okay? Because that is a mixture of biomechanical processes, and I see how it's possible to replicate those, but it is such a long way from being able to put a chip in someone's brain so they can do that, to being able to put a chip in someone's brain so that they can decide whether they're going to forgive or not, or whether Alexa could decide whether Alexa is going to forgive or not. What I'm cautious about is what I would call a reductive view of human being. The thing that keeps wanting to reduce us and say these things that are crucial to our lived experience are actually either don't need explaining, which is a little bit odd to me, or are easily and trivially explained as reducible to maths and physics. Because I'm just not convinced by those arguments personally, having delved a little bit into some of the philosophical questions.
Who's next with a question? Andy.
So I'm Andy. I'm lead advisor for the Diocese of Chelmsford on formation and wellbeing. I'm enormously grateful that you've travelled here, Chris. Thank you so much for joining us. So I just want to ask what AI is for. You mentioned we don't talk in the same way about tractors, but I think I know what tractors are for. They're for ploughing and they're for planting seeds and they're for transporting logs and stuff like that. As Christians, we have a sense of what human beings are for, and we'd express it in different ways, but we might say something like, we exist in order one day to see God face to face and be transformed in that moment, or something like that. Has anyone done what is AI for? Or is it too difficult even to answer that because the people who have created and control AI mean it to be for a whole lot of different things?
So some people like to talk about artificial intelligence as the 21st century equivalent of electricity. Electricity is a general purpose technology. You can generate and deploy electricity in so many different ways. I think that maybe is quite a helpful way of approaching a question like yours. I also use the phrase artificial intelligence these days a little bit archly because I know that it's a catch-all term that covers a huge range of different ways of using computers. And in a presentation like this, which is not meant to be overly technical, and because it's now become such a ubiquitous term, actually I think that's fine, it's helpful. Let's call it AI because at least we all know we're broadly pointing in the same direction. But as soon as I get into a granular conversation with somebody about the specifics, at that point I really want to say, well, let's make sure we both mean the same thing. I know what I mean by AI. What kind of AI are you talking about? The benefit of that, again, is that it really helps us sometimes to surface this tension, cross-pressure, Taylor might call it, between what looks like a very functional explanation and what actually turns out to be quite a philosophical claim. I tend to give long answers to short questions, I apologise, but let me say one more thing. If you were to ask a member of the government, they would say, we want this AI because we want the efficiency gains. It can save us money, it can help us to make better decisions faster, it'll make our bucks go further. If you talk to a 23-year-old in Silicon Valley, he, because it is still very much he will tell you he wants AI to reduce life's frictions, by which he means he wants you to be able to order a pizza with a single flick of your eyelid. But there are an awful lot of expressions of veiled power going on in all of these expressions of what AI is for and what the benefits are. And again, I think it's helpful on the right occasion just to slow people down and say, hang on a minute, let's just walk through this a little bit more slowly. My last example of that, and this is an overly long answer to your question, I'm sorry, no one's going to give me the job. One of my favourite cartoons on the internet at the moment, two-panel cartoon. On the left-hand side, there's a guy at work, sat at a computer, and his colleague standing next to him. And the guy at the computer saying, look, this is amazing. I put 5 bullet points into ChatGPT, and it produces these 4.5 pages of email. And then the panel on the right is a colleague sat at the computer and a guy standing next to him. And he's turning to his colleague and he's saying, look, this is amazing. I feed this 4.5 pages of text into ChatGPT and it spits out 5 bullet points. Right? What I love about that cartoon is it gives the lie to the claim about efficiency, right? Efficiency in the whole life cycle, as they like to call it. What kinds of efficiencies are we really creating here? And what things are we giving up along the way? And I'm sorry, that's a horrendously long answer to your question.
Thank you. I was fascinated by your part of your response to Bernard, talking about language. And it seems to me I've seen lots of AI computed bits of language, and they are usually very inadequate because they seem to think that linguistics can be understood through linguistics, and there's no concept of metalinguistics, which means that, for somebody who knows a bit about language, it's very easy to see that it's just nonsense. Very briefly, to explain what metalinguistics is.
It would be helpful.
It means the social context of language. If you take sort of the standard thing is a notice in a police station saying uniform must be worn when on duty. You've got the subject, you've got the passive imperative, you've got the adverbial phrase. And how is that different from dogs must be carried on the escalator? Does that mean you can't go on an escalator without carrying a dog? And that is, if you're just looking at linguistics, there is no difference between those. But if you're approaching it through metalinguistics, that's say you understand the social context. It makes sense. Now, I haven't seen any evidence that AI can go beyond linguistics. Is there any evidence?
So again, you start to peel the layers back and you see that there is an awful lot going on. In Jesus' day, you had the Sadducees and the Pharisees. In AI, you have similar theological differences. Okay. So what I didn't talk about in my presentation today was something called good old-fashioned AI, GoFi. There is quite a tension in the community at the moment between those who think that devices like large language models need a metalinguistic functionality in order to stop them hallucinating. In other words, what they need is some kind of symbolic logic to help them not just chop a word up into umpteen tokens and then juggle mathematically very cleverly to spit the tokens out the other side. That is a live debate. Okay. Now, my view is that we as Christians, we've got some skin in this game. We're quite good at this because we've had who knows how many thousand years to wrestle with the way we use language to reference God. God who is wholly other. The original meaning of the word holy. Completely different, right? And what are the pressures, what are the pitfalls of misusing language to describe God? Christianity has done an astronomical amount of thinking about that. Not enough, in my view, not enough thinking has gone into that role of language itself, simply in the act of description in artificial intelligence itself, notwithstanding the bigger questions about metacognition and things like that. So we have something very helpful to add to these conversations. I'm very alive to the fact that my descriptions of God, I'm always, to use that phrase I love from Rowan Williams, I'm always working at the very edge of words. I'm always stretching the meaning almost to breaking point. And there's a lot going on in that small word almost, isn't there?
Thank you, Francis.
Not a philosophical question, but I can see the advantages of AI and how that's going to really change our lives. But I'm also concerned about the controls on AI, or lack of controls. And speaking as a retired teacher, at university, children put their essays through plagiarism algorithms to check if there's any plagiarism. How would you do that for, now that AI is out there, writing all the essays for children, for students? How's that? Or otherwise, do we have to change the way that we assess the students because we can't manage the AI? We've seen on the news some time ago, I think in Hollywood, the actors were concerned, anyone in the creative and performing arts industry with their careers, they don't want their work copied because that's how they make their living.
Yeah.
And not necessarily a top Hollywood star, but any musician or artist, do they want this work copied and used without recognition? So I worry about the management of the AI in those areas, because I think that's an important thing. I'm not sure yet that I've heard of any solutions to what I consider the disadvantage of AI, rather than just the advantages, which are obviously very impressive. But what we're going to do about those other issues?
So one of the big challenges with technology is that there has been a tendency to privatise the profits and socialise the losses. And the mantra which feeds into that, move fast and break things, act first and apologise later, and the lack of regulation and the lack of real judicial teeth, all of that feeds into basically a culture where the idea, it seems at the moment to be, we'll deploy this stuff and then we'll throw it out into the public and we'll make as much money as we can and we'll all just pick up the pieces afterwards. That seems to be, to me, what's going on at the moment. I think that there are very good reasons to be really quite concerned about the impacts of things like ChatGPT on our ability to tell what is real and what isn't as a society in the next however many years. I think that it is important for governments to begin to regulate more aggressively. Should start by saying, yeah, do what you want as long as it's safe, and if it's not safe, then polluter pays and you're going to pay for it and pick up the pieces. So that's one element in my view. But the bigger element is days like this, right? It's crucial that we, as the ordinary members of the culture and society in which we live, it's crucial that we start to wrestle with some of this stuff in order to articulate back, no, this is what we want. And I think there are two steps to that. One step is that personal act, personal choice of no, actually, I know my phone is trying to addict me. I know my phone is designed to keep me going back to it. I know my phone is designed to make me act compulsively around it. I'm going to actively take steps to resist that. Right? So there's a personal element there. And then there is, I think, a corporate element where we begin to wrestle with some of this stuff and say, no, we won't put up with this. I'm reading a book at the moment, and again, horrendously long answer to a short question. Guy wrote a book called Blood in the Machine, a chap called Brian Merchant, published in November of last year. And he has reconstructed the history of the Luddites in this country. Luddite is a rude word. I'm often called a Luddite because I only ever like to talk about the negatives and the risks with this stuff. Okay. And again, I realised after a little while that the people who were calling me a Luddite didn't know what a Luddite was, but neither did I, so I probably ought to go away and read up on it. This book is fascinating. Brian Merchant is trying to map the history of Luddism in the first industrial revolution in this country to resistance to technology in this century. So I learned that the first people to suggest a tax on robots, and a tax that would be hypothecated, so that tax would be specifically used to retrain workers who were put out of a job by these robots. The first people to suggest that were the Luddites. So what I think is going to happen, and this is why I mention this, I think what is going to happen is that at a certain point we're going to begin to say we want to revisit history here and think about some of the things that other cultures and societies have wrestled with and the lessons they've learned and what wisdom we might gain from them. But there are huge power imbalances here, and if we don't start by acknowledging that, then we're in trouble before we go anywhere.
Yeah, I sort of changed my mind about 300 times since you asked the questions, which I don't think a computer would actually do. It would have, this is what I need to ask, and so on. Yeah, I was thinking, I'm thinking now, is it a question of what we use these devices for? Because I, like many others, have a mobile phone, a smartphone. Now, I have one friend who has decided to do away with his smartphone, not murder it, I hasten to add, because he can't cope with all the messages and all the stuff coming through, and he said, people are sending me messages, I'm getting this, I'm getting that. And I said, well, turn it off. You know, if you're getting these messages, turn them off. Switch your phone off at night or whatever. So I wonder if it's the fact that we somehow seem afraid to take control of these things, or we let it take over our lives. And as many people will do, they'll be walking down the street and they have their phone in front of them and they can't see where they're going. So I wonder if it's that, you know, we're sort of giving up rather than the machines are actually taking over. And if I could just say something else, because coming to this event, I had a sort of strange experience. It's not mystic or anything, but I was looking for a board game which I know that I have. And I looked in the house, in every room, and it's not there. So I thought, well, in that case, it must be in the garage. So I came out a little early today to look for it, and it wasn't there. And I thought, it must be there. So I looked around again, and it still wasn't there. And I thought, it has to be, because I know I've got it. And I was picking up other boxes which bear no resemblance to what I was looking for, thinking, I have to find it, because I know it's here. I don't think a machine would have done that, it would have stopped. But the other thing that then, in doing that, I found something else, and I thought, oh, that's really useful. I've actually found something that I wasn't looking for. So I do think there's a difference between us and machines, and you know, I wonder if it's that we don't recognize that enough, and we perhaps tend to worship machines now, or is there a tendency going, we have to worship this, and we have to, as you were saying, become addicted to it. We do what it says. And I think that's, for me, seems to be the danger.
To respond to that, I think there are 2 or 3 different elements in what you've said there. I do think there is a certain portion of humankind that does, again, stretching words, does tend towards worshipping this kind of technology, because it's putting a great deal of faith in what the technology either can do right now, or they are convinced will be able to do in very short order. So I do think there's an element of that. I'm a little bit cautious these days about pointing the finger at people and saying, you know, it's your fault that you spend too much time on your phone. Because what I realise, the more I read about this stuff, is the more companies like Meta have employed hundreds of psychologists. We have this thing in us called machine bias, automation bias and machine bias. This tendency to trust a machine. If the machine said it, it must be true. Right? Companies have invested a lot of money in trying to work out how human beings work so that they can game those human tendencies for their own, typically pecuniary benefit. They want to make money from us. So the more I read about this stuff, the less inclined I am to wag the finger and say, well, it's your fault. You know, it's lack of self-control. No, we need to take some steps, and we are different to the machines, and we can do that. But we also need a bit of grace and a bit of help, and we can offer that to each other, I think.
in order to take some steps, collectively we have to agree on an ethical and legal framework. And I guess we're some way off from doing that. Can I just run past an image a memory which keeps coming to my mind, and that is of the film 2001, or the follow-up. Was it 2001 in which the computer, they set off, and it turned out that the computer ended up trying to kill the astronauts. And the problem underlying that was that with the best of intentions, the humans who programmed the computer had put in conflicting messages. And so often as humans, we actually have a lot of very different and possibly contradictory wishes, which basically the machine, in this fairly simple example, just worked through to its logical conclusion. So even in that case, there's a danger in asking the machine to do something in exactly what we're asking it, and the criteria were laid out. And it must presumably be an awful lot more complicated in all kinds of other scenarios.
So the posh term for that is the alignment problem, and there are astronomical amounts of words being generated by computer programmers and others wrestling with the alignment problem. Can we create this super intelligent AI from their perspective, and can we align its goals with ours so it doesn't destroy us? So there are practical questions here, and then there are philosophical questions, and I think we will tend towards one end or the other of that spectrum, depending on our personalities. At this point, I'm more interested in the practical questions, to be honest. It seems to me that the alignment problem in conventional AI is not that it's going to destroy us, it's that people are very interested in the profit motive and much less interested in the social costs. And until we address that, we're not going to make a great deal of progress. There are lots of different high-level ethical initiatives and summaries of the kind of processes that AI ought to be driving towards. I quoted some of them for you from Bletchley, but how do you turn an ambition, a vague ambition, to be human-centred into ones and noughts? I mean, that's very difficult in itself, isn't it? So to some extent, that's where we are. And just again, to open this out to the biggest extent, there are transnational issues here. So the big tech companies are multinationals, global conglomerates. America historically has been the most regulation light. China is going its own way. And there are various reasons why you might actually quite like some of the things the Chinese government is doing with its AI, but there are also reasons why you might well be quite uncomfortable with some of the things it's doing. The EU, European Union, has just this week introduced and ratified the Artificial Intelligence Act, and the UK is sitting somewhere between the EU and America, and the current Conservative government has made a very definite policy decision that it thinks it's too soon to regulate this stuff. It wants a pro-innovation approach, and it does not want yet to formally regulate this stuff too tightly. And so one of the things that's happening at the moment is we're starting to get what you may or may not regard as a Brexit benefit, but we're beginning to diverge from the European Union. And that may or may not continue to the point where what's called our data adequacy agreement with the EU, which is currently coming in for quite a lot of scrutiny, actually ends up getting suspended. All that will do is make our lives a bit less enjoyable. It won't make a huge amount of difference to the people making money, I don't think. But these are again, this is at best, I hope, a starter for 10 for much broader conversations that I hope you all will continue to have, because we're all equally invested in the consequences. Right? They're going to follow us down to the supermarket with our loyalty card. They're going to follow us with our Oyster card. They're going to follow us every time we log onto the internet. And one of the things which one of the Sunday papers was talking about today was how many of our fellow countrymen and women are actually digitally excluded at the moment. Okay? And we, the church, Christians, right? We need to be front foot on that stuff. Because when the government talks about digitising everything in the name of efficiency, there are astronomical numbers of people who stand to be materially harmed. The quality of their lives will get so much worse if that stuff is rushed into without adequate forethought. And that is a moral question to me. You've been very patient. I know you have a question.
Penny, let me come with the microphone.
Thank you. You mentioned social cost, and I think that's something that we're all concerned with. Yes, we've benefited tremendously from technology, but we have a huge problem with mental health right across the spectrum, but particularly with young people. And as somebody growing older, does anybody think it's worthwhile looking at mental health and going back to asking people while we're still here in Compos Mentis how perhaps we were more content before we had all this technology, and perhaps we're more relaxed because we're not so, inverted commas, addicted to using it. And I think these are great concerns. And I feel ashamed to say this, but I will say it. I do not have a mobile phone. Now, I have an iPad, which I use at home with Wi-Fi, and that gets me through a lot of the things I need. But when I leave that at home and I'm out, I don't have any way of communicating with anybody. And if I work for a big institution, I'm retired now, I can see that that would be not possible. But I don't, and I do not miss not being tracked by everybody trying to get in touch with me all the while. I feel I'm free and quite happy. I can catch up with people when I get home, and I don't have a problem with that. But I see so many people, especially with young children, talking constantly on a phone, and they are not really engaging with the baby in the pram or the toddler in the pushchair. They are just completely, sadly, missing out on something. But more importantly, so are those little people who don't have a voice. So these aren't academic questions, but it all comes under the umbrella of those two words you said: social
harms.
Yes. Anyway, thank
No,
you.
no, you're absolutely right. And it is principally young people. There is a generation who have paid an astronomical toll because they have grown up in an era of social media which was completely unregulated, and where over the last decade or more a very demonstrable set of harms have been identified, and yet the really big tech companies still aren't taking those seriously because they threaten the bottom line. So you're absolutely right there. I'm intrigued that you say with some sense of guilt about not having a mobile phone, because first of all, that to me is a symptom of cross pressure. Right? Why? Why would you feel guilty? But second of all, join me on the dais. Let's start a new neo-Luddite movement here, shall we?
Don't you feel sad that you didn't have a mobile phone when you were a child? No.
No, absolutely.
We weren't missing anything. We really were not. There was no void that I can pinpoint. I know it was a different era, the world changes and all of that, but we weren't being meant to feel that there was something deficient. Far from it.
Yeah. So there's some evidence that children who spend astronomical amounts of time on various social media platforms actually do, by their own volition, begin to detach in their early 20s. But it's all the harms that have been accumulated along the way, which we just can't afford to ignore, I think. And just again to reaffirm, I think hopefully you're reinforcing something I said earlier, because I think there are some ancient wisdoms which we as a culture and a society would benefit from tapping into. And part of that is the lived experience of people who completely predate all of this technology.
In case everybody's despairing, I wanted to share a story which I've already shared with this lady actually, because I'm a gossip. I do something with our young people on a Friday evening, and one of the things we do is we play Articulate, and where you, instead of charades, where you have to describe it, which is a bit of a challenge for all of us. But one of the 14-year-olds was challenging her teammate, another 14-year-old, on questions that come up on the card. And the clue she gave was, sitting on your phone. And her teammate said, with hardly a nanosecond between, bored. So I think we can be a bit more confident in young people, maybe not the generation that have got kids, who were more victims of social media than participants. I think there is this sense of burgeoning reality for young people, that it's a tool over which they need to exert control, and the fact that they recognise that they spend too much time on it because they're bored, to me seemed a really healthy sign.
We've had some really lovely questions. I think we've probably got time for 2 or 3 more. Yeah, no, go on.
Hello. So my question's around AI and ethics. So if we accepted, for example, that AI automation has some uses, say GPS, for example, I'm guessing a lot of people might use sat-nav in their cars, phones, whatever you might use it as, and you're asking your sat-nav to get you from A to B as quickly as possible because people are in a rush. I guess the ethics side of that question would be, who decides the parameters of what is get me there quickly? So the computer is deciding take a left, a right, straight, X, Y, and Z, but it doesn't tell you stop at the traffic lights, watch out for the person, wait for the rain to stop, whatever it might be. Looking at AI and ethics more broadly, you've described a lot of big technology companies having a lot of skin in the game, creating those parameters and how we operate, the money that's invested into them, policing and so on. From a public perspective, obviously we're sitting in church right now, what would you say are the ways you think that the public should be able to input into those ethical frameworks and decisions? Like, what are the avenues for people to be able to do that? I'd be very interested in.
Yeah, you've asked a very difficult question to answer because I don't think there are enough of them. Part of my role has given me the opportunity and privilege of sitting in civil society organisations who are engaged in some of these issues. And there's quite a lively civil society organisation, so charities, some of which are well funded, some of which are tiny and really living from week to week, but specialising in particular areas. And I think that it would be my pleasure to recommend some names to you if you were interested to explore that, and that would be one avenue. The other option would be to use Google and see what it says about opportunities to engage with some of the ethical stuff here. But fundamentally, there's not enough of this going on. And the clarion call of civil society, not least at the AI Summit in November, was, hang on a minute, you're excluding us, you're ignoring us, there are loads of us clamouring at the door, let us in. And the government absolutely was not inclined to. So you've named a good problem. I'm more optimistic that there are more people who see it's a problem and are willing to give their own time and energy to try and solve it. And last thing to say is that I think one of the pieces which a number of civil society organisations are beginning to coalesce around is the idea of people's panels. That's a deliberative way of engaging, and it seems to be a way which responds, which deals with the problem in a way that broader society will then get around and affirm, because it's a tried and tested approach. So yeah, join a people's panel.
There was another question over here, I think. No? No?
Hi, I just want to thank you for your time and everybody else actually in the room for your really excellent questions. I think people have articulated a lot of my immediate concerns in a way that I would not be able to articulate. So what's come to my mind now is I feel that there's a lot of, maybe not so much panic, but everybody is thinking about in the immediate and short term. But I guess I'm thinking about AI in the context of evolutionary biology. So looping back to the gentleman's first question, sort of about transhumanism, we've already got Neuralink and Elon Musk interfacing AI with humans. AI is a tool in selection pressure, so if we have, generations of babies and children kind of being brought up using technology, how is that altering the kind of neural programming in the brain? So I just wonder, is anybody looking at like succession and legacy planning for successive generations, because I'm really optimistic about humans, that we will be here. Could AI force a new evolutionary branch point, beyond, wealth inequalities? Could we look at, what does it mean for Homo sapiens more broadly? Because I don't know if it was Elon Musk that had said, humans won't be replaced by AI. Humans with AI will replace humans without AI. And it comes back to another point that I think people have made about the autonomy and agency, that maybe I am a neo-Luddite, or maybe I want to be a full-on old-school Luddite, break that frame, and I don't want to engage because it's offering me nothing positive. So, yeah, I'm not really sure what that question is in the end, but yeah, could it prove an evolutionary branch point for us as a species, long term?
Wearing my science and theology hat and trying to think back to all the things I've ever read about evolution, I think surely the answer to your question is, well, yes, it could, but I don't think it's self-evident that it will. And I think that what is now, I believe, called the neo-Darwinian synthesis is almost like an algorithm, because it's a set of steps and processes which cumulatively give rise to what we, for our own sake of shorthand, call evolution. So I think you've raised, again, an important but complicated question. I don't want to give you a simplistic answer, except to stick on the end that I am a lot more worried about the short-term, immediate, obvious consequences to society than I am about what, to my particular mind, look like largely hypothetical risks at some point in the future. And evolutionary pressures and evolutionary changes are going to be at a scale and at a pace that neither you nor I can do anything in particular about those things, except indirectly by sorting out the pressures and challenges we face here and now, and that is an urgent task.
It is important that we address those immediate concerns, otherwise, maybe we won't be here. But I just wondered, sort of like, are those conversations, like, yes, there are things that we need to address now, and this is an urgent priority, but I just wonder, I think, sort of as you'd said in response to some of the other questions, like stepping back and kind of looking at a bigger picture, that if we are making decisions now for successive generations to come, like, are they also in the room? So a bit like to your point, we want representation, but also successive generations to come, as we are kind of like guardians of our ancestors. So, yeah. Anyway, thank you very much.
So one of the interesting things about the Enlightenment worldview, Charles Taylor doesn't talk about this so much, but it's an interesting feature of the Enlightenment worldview, is that it is linear, it's a straight line, and it's, in theory, it's progressive. Right? Now, the cross pressures that we're all experiencing at the moment are, hang on a minute, doesn't feel particularly linear, doesn't seem like today is always better than yesterday, and second of all, surely we're on a small blue marble, Kate Raworth's donut economics. We're living beyond our means. This can't go on forever, can it? So one of the things that I think is probably going to happen And I'm not reckless enough to predict when. But I think one of the things that is going to happen is that my children, my grandchildren, will probably have a significantly different worldview than the one I was brought up in. And that will be much more cyclical, I think, and it'll be much more mutual. And that's important because they will owe an appreciative debt to their forebears, but they will also be paying real attention to those generations that come after them in a way that those of us steeped in the Enlightenment frankly have not done.
I've got a final question. Is there another one before that? No? Okay. I was ordained and was a curate in Oxford Diocese, and actually I was at my curacy church on Friday for a funeral, singing in the choir. And the person who died was definitely an early adopter of technology. He used to get in massive trouble for being on his phone in church. He was looking up the Hebrew and the Greek so that he could follow that alongside the Bible readings being read in English. And he had an Apple Watch which notified his family and friends and the emergency services that he was really, really poorly. Sadly, in his case, that didn't make a difference, but it also recorded his time of death very accurately. I think that's probably a good thing. I think that's AI. What I'm getting up to say is that I'm really conscious of the Bishop of Oxford's presence in the Lords and his focus around AI. I just wondered if you could say something briefly. I know you are supporting all of that around the policy influence and what the Church of England is doing in terms of public good. Yeah.
So something called the Online Harms White Paper was published by the government in the late 2018s, 2019s, turned into something that is now called the Online Safety Act. And so for the last 5 years or so, I've worked really closely with the 26 bishops who sit in the House of Lords, helping to improve that particular piece of legislation as it went through the House of Lords. It's not a perfect piece of legislation by any stretch, but it's a really good first step. It's a lot better than no legislation at all. On Wednesday of this week, the Data Protection and Digital Information Bill comes to their lordships, having gone through the House of Commons, and then the government have just changed it enormously without giving any time for scrutiny. If you are so minded, you will say that the DPDI is a fantastic opportunity for us to get a Brexit benefit. If you're less sanguine, you might say that it looks like it's going to materially weaken our rights and opportunities over our own data for various reasons. And we will be attempting, I think, to scrutinise that legislation and perhaps in places where we think it's particularly defective, to vote in order to strengthen it through amendment. That will take at least the next 2 or 3 months, assuming that no general election is called. I've already said a little bit about the Conservative government's attitude to AI. I think it's an open question what Labour's attitude is. There are things they're sure to want to adopt, and probably fairly quickly. They're maybe a little bit more open to discussion with civil society, but that remains to be seen as well.
Thank you for your answer to that and for everything that you shared with us this afternoon, Simon. Thank you, Andy and the Diocese of Chelmsford for the funding that you provided, and thank you to all of you for coming. And I think we've had a really fantastic range of questions that have helped us to explore thoroughly this whole topic and the ethics and what we might take forward in terms of thinking things through. So thank you to all of you. Thank you.
Thank you.
I am just about to boil the kettle. There is banana cake. We have got vegan and gluten-free snack and drink options. There will be a service in the style of Taizé starting at 5:30 in the chapel, and we've got at least a couple of the musicians with us already, so I imagine we'll let them go first to get a cup of tea and they might start warming up in the background. If you'd like to stay for that, you're most welcome. And I imagine, Simon, I know you've got to catch a train at some point, but I hope we can have some more chat with you over tea and so on. Thank you all very much indeed. We're going to be serving things over here and the service will be over there. Thank you.